These tall-footed bowls are a form I've wanted to make for a long time, but until now I've never felt that the 3 glazes I use would suit them very well. But after all the glaze testing I've done recently, I think I have a few that will suit the forms rather nicely, such as this one, which is a test I actually made incorrectly, where I used 10% red iron oxide instead of stain, but thank goodness I made a note of the error, as it's really beautiful. Part metallic, part matte. I can't wait to see it coating some actual pots. So here's the cross section of the form I'll be throwing next. And as you can see, these forms are all about getting the clay distribution right. As always, the process begins by centering the clay, but in this instance, the shape I begin with for making the pot will be quite different compared to that I usually start with. The clay is coned up and down a number of times. This helps to align the clay's particles and is essentially sort of like wedging, but on the wheel. What I'm aiming for here, instead of a low puck sort of shape, which is what I'm usually after, is a tall cylindrical form with a flat top, and then really it's just like throwing off the hump, where only the top portion of the lump of clay is worked, and I simply leave the clay beneath it as one solid lump, which I'll eventually trim into various shapes and forms. So once I'm ready, I open up the lump of clay and make a well that goes about halfway down. As this process sort of squashed the entire lump, I just cone it back up again to make it taller, and then I essentially just proceed to throw a bowl atop the solid block of clay, just like I normally would. That being said, this is still the first time I've made this shape, so I was learning a huge amount each time I threw one. This is the part of the process that's easy, I think, as fundamentally I'm just making what is quite a basic shape atop a solid mass of clay. It's the trimming which will be the more complex part, especially hollowing out the tall foot ring. Once the lip of the bowl is more or less at my throwing gauge's pointer, I spend a moment throwing in the curve I want in the bowl's form. I kept the top sections of these, the bowl and its walls, relatively thin, as I don't want to trim them too much later on. And then, once I'm happy with the shape, I can move on to the finishing procedures, where I get ready to remove the pot from the wheel, and that begins by removing the excess water from the inside. And then I find a curved kidney that I can place into the form and press out against the walls. This simply acts as a template, and as the tool has a nice curve, that's imparted onto the walls of the pot. I then carefully scrape away the excess slip on the outside of the shape using a very basic but incredibly sharp metal edge. And then for the base, I just use a blunted old turning tool to scrape away the outer layer of soft, wet clay that surrounds the pot's pedestal. And for this section of the pot, I really tried to remove as much of the slip as I possibly could, because it is such a thick mass of solid clay. I don't want it to take too long to dry out to leather hard as compared to the top section of the bowl, which will dry out very quickly in comparison. So I scrape away this outer layer so there's no slip whatsoever. And this also helps me lift the piece away, as I can just grasp this section of the pot, which is strong and stable, and lift it away without anything deforming. Like so. And here's what the inside of the bowls look like, smooth and with a nice even curve from top to bottom. Although really, it's the stem of these pots I'm most interested in. The bowls are the simple part, whereas the feet can be trimmed into so many different shapes. At least that's the idea. I want to trim the foot of each one of these to be slightly different. It turned out that one of the trickier parts of this process was drying them in such a way that everything ended up being the same consistency. The thin bowl, the column that it sits upon, and that's the tricky bit, as I want the clay on the outside of the foot ring to be the same consistency as the clay on the inside. So I ended up keeping them exposed overnight and then wrapping them up in plastic for a couple of days so the clay had a chance to dry really slowly, and at this point they were pretty much ready to trim, and the tool foot felt just as firm as the rim of the bowl. And this aspect of making pottery, which is learning how is best to keep things at the right consistency or to dry things slowly so that they're at the perfect condition to work on, can be a difficult thing to learn, as it does take time and experience and a few boards of pots that you either forgot about or didn't wrap up well enough, which turned too firm and you just had to recycle. I'm sure every potter's been through that. Luckily for me, trimming is easily my favourite part of the process, and I say that because these little tool-footed bowls required a lot of it. But there is an alternative which you could do, which is to throw a regular bowl without any foot, and then simply attach and throw another piece of clay into the shape of the foot you want. But that isn't the method I prefer, and you do run the risk of a crack developing where the new foot ring meets the leather hard pot. Additionally, it means you have to wait a second time for the foot ring itself to turn leather hard, but when they're all thrown as one, like I've done so here, there's no risk of any cracks developing, and I only have to wait for the pot to turn leather hard once. So what started out as a cylindrical base, I'm now going to trim so it's conical, like so, a form that's wider at the base and then tapers in to a narrow waist just where it meets the bowl. And for these, I trim the entirety of the outside form before I begin to carefully remove the clay from inside the foot ring. The benefit of having a nice solid top is that I can push a lot of pressure with my left hand down onto the bowl to keep it in place as I trim. But essentially this process is quite simple, as there's so much material to work with. I can trim away quite vigorously. The only area at this point I need to be very careful with is the corner where the foot ring meets the interior of the bowl, and this is why I just removed it to check. And this is something I'll do, especially with new forms which I haven't got much experience with. I'll remove them periodically, feel the cross section with 2 fingers, and that way I can tell which parts of the pot need to be trimmed more or less. Then, once the outside form has been trimmed, I turn the top so it's flat and level, and then I'll proceed to slowly removing the clay from inside the foot. But first, I just add a soft beveled edge to the base of the piece, which provides a nice clear indication of where the glaze goes up to. As opposed to having a rounded base, I like to have these sharp edges, so it's easy to know where the glaze needs to finish. And then I can slowly begin to bore away the clay bit by bit from inside the foot. And this is where the time really starts to add up, as once you get past the first few layers, much of the clay that you remove ends up just filling the hole. So there comes a point where you need to just remove the trimmings as you're going in order to be able to tunnel any further. And during this process, I'm trying to trim the walls of the foot so that the cross section sort of matches the upper section of the bowl. I don't mind if they're a tiny bit thicker, and the section that actually comes into contact with the kiln shelf needs to be a bit sturdier too than the thin, delicate rim of the bowl, because not only do we want it to hold its shape during the firing as the clay twists and unwinds, but it's also going to be the section of the piece which is knocked around the most. And what I mean by that is it'll be picked up, put down, and so on. So it needs to be stronger in order to withstand all this physical contact. And then, once the pot's more or less finished, I can stamp it with my maker's mark, which my friend Mark Tallowin made this lovely case for all my stamps. I hand-carved all of these, but I tend to only use the smallest for the most part. I then carefully push the mark into a flat section inside the foot, as I'm still not entirely sure whether I'll glaze the insides of the feet or not. And it doesn't matter so much at this point, as this batch of footed bowls is just my first attempt. I'm sure there'll be more after that, and as I go through various iterations, I'll figure these small things out, such as stamp placement, foot height, bowl width, and so on. When making ceramics, you really need to see some forms through to the glaze firing, even if you aren't sure about them, as there are just some things you won't learn until that point. You'll notice as I work that every single time I turn the pot the other way, I scrape clean the wheel head, especially when I'm placing the rim down onto the metal. I do this because I don't want any tiny burrs of clay or specks of dirt to stick into the delicate rim. It may seem over the top, but this is a process I do sort of subconsciously these days. And whilst of course I don't mind if one tiny speck of clay embeds itself into the rim, in the long term I'm sure it's prevented larger pieces sticking, and now it's just become a habit. I place 3 lugs of clay around the pot, pressing them carefully against the metal wheelhead and not directly into the pot, as to deform it, and then I can begin trimming. You'll notice as I work that I quite often rest my 2 thumbs together. This adds stability to my movements as I work, as one supports the other, and in the background you'll notice that I lean my elbow onto my thigh and lean my upper body weight over that arm. All of this is done to ensure that the hand that holds the tool is kept as still and steady as possible. As I've mentioned before, if any undulation comes along, I want to trim straight through it, rather than let that undulation influence my trimming. And in that way, at least for my style of work, I find the turning process to be far more mechanical as compared to when actually throwing the pot, which relatively is a very fluid process. But by mechanical, I don't mean that the pot itself will look mechanical, as if made by a machine. Instead, I mean it's the way you have to hold your body during this process, which is quite the opposite of fluid, although an experienced potter can certainly make it look so. As I trim into the thicker core of these foot rings, the clay does become slightly softer the deeper I go, so care does need to be taken on how much pressure is applied, and the deeper I go, the softer my touch, as the damper clay inside doesn't need as much pressure applied to it in order for it to be removed. I wish I had this same shaped trimming tool, but with a tungsten carbide blade, as while I love this shape for tunneling down into foot rings like this, the looped metal blade itself is really quite blunt, which certainly adds to the time spent trimming these. That being said, the only bonus you'll find from using slightly blunted tools is that they leave a lovely smooth finish when you trim with them, as compared to the ultra-sharp tungsten carbide ones, which have a tendency to chatter a little bit, especially when used on any kind of clay body that contains a little bit of grog. As I trim, you'll notice that I periodically blow a large gust of air into the foot ring. This is done to simply dislodge any tiny bits of clay that come off during this process and become stuck in the bottom. The smaller the pieces of clay that come off, the more troublesome this process becomes, as you can't just easily remove them, and the tool itself can end up compressing them back into the clay that you're trimming. So there really is an awful amount of back and forth when turning these. I suppose you could, in theory, leave these pedestals to be completely solid. They'd certainly be more stable, but they'd also have a vastly heavy base, which would be quite a shock when you go to pick them up, as the rim of the bowl on these is thin and delicate, and it's through that point on the pot where we perceive how light or heavy the weight, essentially, that the pot will be. A very thin rim, especially on a piece of tableware, gives the impression that the pot itself is light and delicate, whereas a thick, chunky rim does entirely the opposite. And what you don't want is a mismatch, and what I mean by that is a pot that appears to be made with finesse, with a fine rim, suddenly being very heavy when you go to pick it up. It can be quite a jarring experience as the object defies your expectations, and the same thing can happen when you pick up a pot that looks light and it's even lighter than you imagined, and it sort of floats off the table in your hands, and that's a defying of expectations, which I really like. Once I had trimmed a few standard feet, which tapered in from bottom to top like previously, I started to have some fun and turned a wide variety of different shapes, some perhaps more functional than others, and some provided a real challenge when it came to trimming out the clay from inside the foot ring, as I'm not just trimming a straight hole all the way down. In fact, I'm trying to mirror what the outside of the foot ring is doing on the inside. The idea with these, eventually, is to have 5 or 6 which I really like, which I can display together in a group, perhaps for an upcoming exhibition I have early next year. As I'll be applying new glazes to these, I think there's a high chance that a few might not make it through the firings, but that's part of the process. Developing and testing new glazes is never that straightforward, and with any luck, for next week, I'll be making a video that goes far more in depth into all the glaze testing I did over my last 6 reduction firings. I'm just trying to figure out a good structure and story for the video first. And then finally, I push in my maker's mark and rock it from corner to corner, instead of just pushing it directly down, as this not only leaves a clearer impression, but if I were just to push blindly down, there's a good chance I'd just pierce a hole in the base of the bowl, which isn't ideal. I've always really liked bowls with tall foot rings. It gives the piece a certain quality of elegance, as it's raised up on its own small pedestal and makes for a very enticing section of the pot, which wants to be picked up and held, sort of like how a cup or mug might. These are of course taking it to an extreme, and it does change the functionality of the piece, lending itself more as a vessel to drink from, or to eat ice cream from, or at least that's the impression I get. Or perhaps, most of all, it almost just becomes more of a decorative object, like a trophy, which are often raised up on their own pedestals. The bowls I make, for instance, have always had tall feet. I purposefully leave their bases to be about 15mm thick. That way there's plenty of material to trim a nice tall foot from. But when there's this much material to remove, it really does remind me of turning wood on a lathe, which is something I've never had a go at, but I'd really love to. I do wonder if there are any transferable skills between the two processes. Form and proportion would definitely carry over, but I'm sure the process of subtracting material is very different. And usually I don't speed up footage in my videos, but in some cases I think it can be useful, as you can quite quickly see the difference in form a certain area undergoes as it's trimmed. Plus you get some interesting things going on with the lugs of clay, which are holding the pot firmly in place. With my summer online shop out of the way, I'm now gearing up and making for the winter one, alongside making numerous pieces for a few more projects. So much of my practice is based upon repetition, be it making mugs, bowls, various cup forms, teapots and vases. So I think inevitably there will be videos that I create here that show the same objects being made, but it provides an interesting opportunity for me to attempt to do so differently each time, be it filming it a different way or describing a new process, no matter how subtle. It's why I find making pots like this, which are completely different and new, a very welcome break, as it opens up new pathways and pushes me out of my comfort zone. This piece especially, with the 2 interlocking curves, is very un-Florian Gadsby, but out of all of these pedestaled bowls I've made, it was by far my favourite. And there are always ideas and little things that I pick up when making work like this that find their way back into my usual routine of making, which is totally self-prescribed, I should add. In this sped up section of video, you'll see just how many times I go back and forth, correcting certain bits, removing more clay, smoothing, refining, and so on. It's faffing, really, but when you're learning to make new pieces, it's wholly necessary, and it's one of the things that needs to be eliminated when you're teaching yourself to repetition make quickly, which is another whole topic for a video I want to make on tips on repetition throwing. And last, but not least, I thought it's probably necessary to make a foot that's as simple as it can be. One that simply travels straight up and down with one vertical plane. If only I could actually trim them this quickly. And here they are, in a row, slowly turning bone dry, hence the white discoloration you can see in the rim on some of them. Together, like this, I think the varying shapes really work well, but who knows how they'll look once clad in black. Time will tell. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.